They are some of the world's most notorious serial killers.
He was like a god when he had a corpse as his plaything.
But were these psychopaths born evil, or did their mothers make them into monsters?
A mother may actually dote on a child too much.
I'm Donald McIntyre, and I'm on a quest to explore how some of history's most horrific murderers were moulded by their dysfunctional relationships with their mothers.
When it comes to people who are pathological, psychopathic, the influence of the mother is absolutely dominant.
I'll be piecing together events in their childhoods and talking to criminologists and psychologists to try to understand what motivated their monstrous crimes.
We had never come across a serial killer who'd killed that many people.
In this program, Jed Allen, the Wolverine killer. In 2015, the 21-year-old stabbed to death his own stepfather, his 6-year-old half-sister, and his mother.
He lost it. It was a short, brutal attack, multiple stab wounds.
Did his rocky relationship with his mother while growing up sow the seeds for this horrific triple murder?
He was frustrated by her drug habit. As he said, she was a junkie, and she couldn't get her life together.
Jed Allen was a young man who appeared on the surface to have his life on track. He had a regular job, was studying for a career at college, and had a close group of friends here in the leafy suburbs of Oxford. But all that came crashing down around him when on May 23rd, 2015, he killed his mother, his stepdad, and his 6-year-old half-sister in a frenzied knife attack. This act seemed totally out of character for Jed.
Nobody could predict that he was actually going to do what he did.
Jed left the scene of the crime and sent an alarming text message to friends. Terrified, they called the police and went to his house.
Getting no answer, looking in the window and seeing Philip Hard's body.
When the police entered the house, to their horror, they discovered not only the body of Jed's stepfather, Philip, but also his mother, Janet. And shockingly, his 6-year-old half-sister, Darren, in pools of blood.
Jed may be seen as a family annihilator because it's very rare for a murderer to kill a mother, father and child.
But what drove Jed to kill his family?
It could be that he suddenly had a psychotic episode, but it's unlikely. He knows what he's done because he sends a text to 7 friends saying, I've done something wrong. So he's quite aware of the ethics of what he's done. It sounds very sane, very sensible, sad case in a way.
In fact, inside the house behind me, Jed had already expressed some remorse for his crimes, albeit in a rather grotesque way. On the wall, written apparently in one of his own victims' blood, he had scrawled, "I am sorry." A bloodied notebook was also found in the kitchen with a message, "I know the truth. I don't want this for my family. This is the end." Clearly a desperate message from a troubled mind. With a triple murderer on the loose, the authorities launched a full-scale manhunt.
The police were certainly concerned to some extent that he would hurt somebody else, in the sense that they warned people not to approach him and that he was potentially dangerous.
With 100 officers involved, the police focused their efforts on the university parks in Oxford where Jed was employed. The search for Jed didn't last long. 2 days after the triple murder, a dog walker near this patch of woodland made a grim discovery. Sadly, 21-year-old Jed had taken his own life. His body was found hanging from a tree. So how does a seemingly normal young man with a job, friends and family go on to commit such a violent and horrendous crime? What does it take to break the ultimate taboos? To kill your own mother and then kill yourself? To find out, we have to look back into Jed's family history and the relationship he had with his mom, Janet Jordan. Jed was born in 1993 in Oxfordshire to mother Janet and father David. He was a wanted and much-loved child, but his parents' relationship broke down and they divorced when he was very young. Jed had a very troubled childhood, moving between mom and dad from an early age. This could have impacted upon his later development. But there was another factor at play that could have helped shape his attitudes and behaviour. His mother had a number of different partners during his formative years.
There would always be some initial resentment of another male person coming into the household. Some of these partners may have taken more interest in him and others less interest in him.
This in many ways has a bad effect on him because he starts to learn to appreciate the relationship with one, and then for whatever reasons that breaks up, and then he's got to start forming another relationship. He seemed to get on well with one of them, the ex-soldier.
Mark Crane was a boyfriend of Janet Jordan, who first met Jed when he was 8 years of age, and the two developed a bond.
Allegedly painted his room, spent time talking to him, and treated him, sounds like fairly well.
Laid down a few things, got on with him well, and may have formed some kind of mentor, somebody that he could look up to as a strong character.
Sadly for Jed, this was yet another fleeting relationship.
I think as Jed got older, he was becoming a man of the house, and he would see them as directly competing for control over the household.
Not only was Jed Allen subjected to many different father figures, but his mother Janet wasn't very discreet about her sexual liaisons. How could this affect a child?
Some would become traumatized, some may become quiet and withdrawn, others may become angry and violent towards other children or adults and start acting out. And indeed, in some cases, we know that some children themselves become sexualized in their behavior. In the case of Alan and what he was exposed to with his mother, I think the problems it was causing were building up inside him in terms of resentment and anger, and this would manifest at a later date.
But did having divorced parents and a mother with multiple partners really turn Jed Allen into a murderer? So, to what extent do you think the divorce and the separation was significant, key to the events which transpired?
The family breakup in it itself is not something that we can, make any kind of causal link with, but it is one of the contextual factors in the background which won't have helped matters. What's undoubtable is it will have an impact upon the relationship with the mother.
He ended up competing for his affections with his mother with the new men in her life.
I think that there are quite a lot of issues that Jed's experiencing here in terms of his control over the relationships within the family. And often when a child doesn't have that control within their early years, they become adults who have an intense need to control their relationships and control what's going on in their lives. And that control can take various forms. It can take the form of self-medication, of issues with substance misuse, or it can translate into violence and harming others.
There's no red flags that it suggests he's going to become the murderer he became.
No, he's not having to cope with violence or sexual abuse or any of those individual risk factors that we might associate with people who go on to kill. I think the only thing that we start to pick up on later on here is the issue of neglect, and that becomes something that's quite significant.
Coming up, Jed watches helplessly as his mother's life begins to spiral out of control.
Her behaviour wasn't how you would behave as a mum.
Jed Allen was a well-liked 21-year-old. He was doing a horticultural course at college and had a gardening job at the local council. But beneath this veneer of normality, there lurked the mind of a killer. In May 2015, he killed his stepfather, his mother, and his 6-year-old half-sister in a brutal knife attack. But without any outward signs of violence or antisocial behaviour before the killings, was there anything in his childhood that drove him to murder? Jed's early childhood was spent growing up around Oxford, and although his parents divorced, his relationship with his mother was good.
Jed and Janet, there was clearly love there. They did get on well. There were periods of their lives where things were going well.
But there was a darker side to Jed's mother, Janet. She suffered from mental health issues from an early age, and by the time Jed was 8, she'd become an alcoholic.
We know that Janet had sort of various problems with drink that may have impacted on the way that they got on. particularly the way that sort of Jed viewed her.
This kind of influence is very destabilising. It also kind of begins to make Jed lose faith in his own mother. He will also probably feel, even as a child, that he wants to do something about it, that perhaps it might be his fault that things are this way. Had he got something to do with the divorce? Was this the reason why his mother is kind of off the rails? Those sort of thoughts and feelings may have been gone through him.
Jed would have had a lot of problems, a lot of conflicts, because Jed would want to love his mother, because that's what you're supposed to do, yet at the same time Jed's faced with an abusive, alcoholic mother who's very aggressive towards him. And Jed would find this difficult. One moment he was loving her, and the next moment he's hating her.
Unfortunately for Jed, Janet's drinking was the beginning of a downward spiral.
Clearly she had lost control due to alcohol, as well as occasional use of heroin and other drugs.
Janet's former partner, Mark, said her behaviour was at times too much to bear, and that this was the reason for their separation.
Mark Crane, on record, said that she was a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde character, great mother, until the booze got into her, and then she was deadly. And I think if he found that stressful, and he's had experience of the wars and everything else, then for a young boy, 8-year-old, this must have been incredibly difficult.
So how did Jed respond to his mother's behaviour?
He probably expressed he was not happy about it, and this probably progressed into being quite stroppy about it, to try and actually parent his own mother into actually having better behaviour. This probably also reflected on Jed in that his own behaviour was completely directed and swamped by coping with the problems in the family, and he wouldn't have his own normal life to enjoy and develop in.
To make matters worse, Janet was known to make regular suicide threats when under the influence of drugs and alcohol.
Jed's mother making what sound like serious threats to kill herself would have had a very negative effect on him, because he would be punishing himself, thinking it was his fault. Could he do something about it? It would disturb his whole psyche, because he wouldn't know how to handle it as a young child.
So how would all of these disruptive and negative experiences impact upon Jed in later life?
In children who are traumatised, who see are exposed to things they shouldn't be at a young age, a violent adulthood, a more aggressive or passive-aggressive adulthood is a normal response to having bottled up that psychological trauma at a younger age.
Between 2002 and 2004, Jed's mom, Janet, further complicated their family situation by bearing 2 children to 2 different men. The arrival of a half-brother and half-sister presented Jed with an entirely new set of challenges.
The arrival of new siblings in the household could have been problematic for Alan, but it appears that he was very good at being a gentle, caring, nurturing older brother. And I'm sure he would have taken on some kind of responsibility of looking after his siblings when his mother wasn't able to or wasn't parenting as well as she should.
But how did his mother's unreliable parenting really impact upon Jed? Jed is still coping reasonably well while his mother seems to be cracking up with alcohol problems and suicide threats.
The level of trauma that Jed is witnessing on a daily basis is becoming more serious. And that places quite a lot of pressure on a young person of this age. So he's feeling helpless. He's learning to feel helpless on a regular basis. Being helpless and not being able to control his situation is becoming a normality for him.
Jed would have taken over, in many ways, the mothering role. There'd been an inversion. The mother became the child, he became the adult. And at what stage did that become problematic?
So Janet was unable to put Jed's needs before her own, and that would have really signified something for Jed, that he has to take control of this situation as a relatively young child. So Janet would have good days, she'd have bad days, it would be quite inconsistent, and that can be incredibly disruptive for children.
He's got now 2 new half-siblings here, 4 and 2 years of age at this stage, and he seems to be taking a rather avuncular role, quite a strong parental role in their lives too, in the absence sometimes of his own mother.
he does seem to be looking out for these younger siblings rather than feeling threatened by them in any way. And I think that is rooted in his concern for their well-being, in his worry that his mum, with her issues with alcohol, is unable to provide the level of care that they need. So he's taking quite a lot on a pair of very young shoulders here.
Under the weight of her demons, Jed's mom, Janet, did show signs of trying to be a better mother. In 2005, she moved with Jed and his 2 young siblings to Kidlington, hoping for a fresh start. Her next-door neighbour remembers Janet with affection.
Jan was a loving, caring, kind, gentle, softly spoken, pleasant girl who loved her children. If Jan didn't have a drink problem, Jan would have been a great mum.
But Jane soon witnessed the troubling events from next door.
The baby, who would have been about 4 or 5 months old, was laid on the patio crying and screaming. This is why we went out to look. And Jan, on the patio, drunk. Our son cleared the fence and went over to pick the baby up. My husband and I ran around to find the little boy playing with electrics. And from then on, the anxiety set in about every noise that went on there. I was anxious about.
Jed would turn to Jane for support when things were tough.
Jed had come around and said to me, "Mummy's drunk again." So sad to see a young man stand there and be on edge and nervous. This fella was a young boy and he was having to deal with what, as an adult, we would find hard to deal with. His feelings must have been so muddled because he loved his mum, she loved him. Her behaviour wasn't how you would behave as a mum. And he had to deal with whatever situation came up in front of him the best way he could. Bless, terrible, terrible for him.
Later on down the line, that led to feelings of anger, feelings of disgust, feelings of revulsion towards his own mother, and no doubt he probably felt guilty for feeling those negative thoughts towards his own mother. So although it didn't cause mental health problems or distress at the time, it was clearly building up problems for later on in life as his mum's chaotic behaviour continued.
He could not understand her motivations. He could not rationalise why she could do this repeatedly. He, as it were, was taking the moral responsibility from her and trying to sort of construct the family and hold it together by his own efforts, which is basically trying to do the impossible.
Jed was taking the weight of the world upon his shoulders. It was enough for anyone, let alone a child. The family he was so desperately trying to protect would soon be ripped apart.
She had driven down the road in a car with the children and that she smacked her into the back of the car because she was drunk. When I asked her, I said, "Jan, I had given the impression that you smacked into the back of the car." And I said, "Were you a bit tiddly-whoops?" And she said, "Yes."
This drunken crash triggered an investigation by social services, which resulted in Jed's younger siblings being removed from the home and put up for adoption. Jed would never see them again. More isolated than ever, Jed witnessed his mom decline even further.
Jan's behaviour after the children were gone, she just went downhill. She just went completely downhill. She just drank more, lost it, I would say. Just lost it.
But it wasn't just Jan who suffered from the loss of her 2 young children. It would also impact heavily on the 11-year-old Jed.
I think this would have dealt quite a blow to Jed. This was, in a way, a destruction of the family unit. This isn't just it careering around in a dysfunctional way. This was actually removing a component of it.
When his siblings were taken into care, he became quite resentful, and then psychological cracks began to show. Whether perhaps he felt guilty that he hadn't protected them enough from his mother's activities, or whether he felt more anger towards his mum, it's not known for certain. But I think that's when the problems started to emerge in his background.
So was this the point when Janet's issues started to make a murderer out of her son? The self-harming in front of kids and the threats to commit suicide must have been so traumatic for Jed.
I think in this situation where you have all of these problems and all of these issues, you've got a young lad who's really struggling. And whilst he might not have experienced, physical violence or sexual abuse, that there's that neglect that's going on there. There's that escalation of him into an adult at a very, very early age. So that has a damaging impact on the rest of his life.
It's of no surprise with that in the background that social services felt the need to jump in, take the kids out. Despite all his good efforts, the family was broken apart and his two half-siblings were sent into care.
And he'd been holding this family together, and that was a real achievement. And he felt responsible for his two younger siblings. He felt very close to them. So often we don't look at the impact on siblings. We only really look at the impact on mothers and on parents. So for him, this was a really big deal. And he has to adapt to a whole new set of circumstances now. He spent quite a lot of time getting used to what's going on within his family unit, to looking after his siblings. Now that's all gone, the slate's wiped clean, he's got to start again, and that's something that's quite devastating for him. When you're confronted with a situation like that, you have this new environment that you have to get used to. Often what some children will do is to internalise that problem and try and escape and try and find a world into which these problems don't exist, where they can escape, where they can forget about everything that's going on.
Coming up, Jed's troubles send him into a dark and violent fantasy world.
People always ask the question, if you watch horror films, does this make you into a killer? And the answer is no.
Jed Allen killed his stepfather, his mother, and his 6-year-old half-sister in May 2015 before killing himself. When police investigated the killings, they struggled to find any motive. But when they looked at his childhood history, a chaotic and traumatic picture emerged, one which would leave deep scars on Jed's troubled mind. From a young age, Jed had experienced his parents' divorce, multiple father figures, 2 young siblings being taken into care, and his mother's ongoing battle with alcoholism. But now, at the age of 15, his time at secondary school was proving positive. He was popular with many friends, and his studies were progressing well. Janet appears to have found some stability in her life as well. She meets Philip Howard, a local supermarket manager here in Kidlington, and they have a daughter together in 2008. Darren is a ray of sunshine in their lives, and it seems that Janet is truly smitten with her.
Generally, neighbours said that they were a nice family. Janet's neighbours said that she was nice. Darren was always very friendly and happy, and they would stop and say hello.
Janet appeared to be in a positive place with her new partner, Philip, and their child, Darren. But how would this new family dynamic affect Jed's relationship with his own mom?
Jed has been with his mother for a number of years. He's looked after her when she's gone through a drunken state. And then Philip comes along and he doesn't get on with him. Philip used to blank him out, not relate to him, and presumably just saw him as a nuisance.
We know that when blended families get together, there's a whole gamut of potential problems that are to be faced by step-parents, natural parents, siblings, half-siblings, stepchildren. It's an incredibly complex situation and a dynamic, fraught situation.
While Jed may not have got along with Philip, he did love his younger sister.
He was there taking his sister to school and things like that, so he's very protective towards her.
From the outside, Jed's new family situation looked fairly stable. But how did he really feel about Philip, Darren, and his mom? He always felt that his relationship with his mother was particularly secure, built upon all the caring he'd done before. Really, he's being sent down that league table.
This is a family that's constantly shifting and evolving as new people come on the scene.
Many people in situations like that, they simply decide, okay, I'm 16, 17, 18, I'll go to a big city, I'll leave and find my fortune and leave this mess behind. And he didn't, because his connection, caring connection with his mother was so intense.
He was so emotionally invested in his relationship with his mother that he couldn't simply just walk away from it, because he was witnessing this cycle happen, you know, time and time again, of a new relationship starting and things being good for a while and then things going downhill. So he didn't feel that he could step away. He felt that he had to be there watching over that cycle, ready to step in when that was required. But what I think is significant about Darren, his younger half-sister, there's some concern for her well-being, I think, because Jed has seen patterns emerge in the past which have resulted in very negative outcomes for the family unit in which he was located at the time. So I think he's got this underlying concern for Darren and a concern for his mother's capacity to care for her.
Unfortunately for Jed, history started to repeat itself when his mother Janet was clearly abusing alcohol and drugs once again. It's now known that both Janet and Philip were using heroin.
If he came to the conclusion that Phil was exacerbating or had caused the heroin addiction, he would have probably had a great deal of anger towards him and an anger towards his mother for neglecting him and choosing heroin.
Jed's looking at a situation basically where he sees a return to the cycle of abuse and problems with his mother that he had, and it's quite feasible that he thought the same was going to happen to his sister, and that would have made him angry and also probably depressed.
I think what made it worse for Alan is that his mum was very capable of being a good mum and a loving mum. When she was on the ball, she was a great parent. But when she was needing substances, she became the complete opposite.
This was something that was way out of control. He's basically trying to control the uncontrollable, and this is destined to lead to what we call learned helplessness. You are not able to control those things in your life that are important. This can precipitate depression.
In 2012, these thoughts became so acute that health professionals got involved.
Jed had gone to his GP back in 2012, and he'd mentioned he had these dark thoughts, that he wanted to harm people, or he considered harming people who had wronged him in the past. And he subsequently had been diagnosed then with depression as a result of that.
But for the health professionals involved, Jed's learned helplessness was difficult to treat.
Medication is directed usually at chemical depression, where you have an imbalance of chemicals and you can temporarily rectify this. Learned helplessness is not so easily affected by medication. It can be moderated, but the fundamental cause of that depression is actually outside of medication and biochemistry. It is the situation he's in.
Although Janet's alcohol and drug dependency was a continued cause of Jed's depression, healthcare professionals did not consider him a threat to those around him.
Saw them for about 6-8 months. They seemed to be quite happy with Jed's behaviour and with his progress. There's nothing to predict that he was going to do this.
These investigations, particularly one as dramatic as a triple murder, are fraught with sensitivities, and sometimes it's nearly impossible to pin down the motives, or indeed to track the perpetrator's feelings and emotions in the crucial months and days prior to the incident. But in this era of social media, Jed did leave some clues for the world to see. Jed's online posts revealed a seemingly normal teenager expressing signs of frustration and depression. But were they a cause for concern?
Comments about how he hated his life and how he wanted people to move on and get on with their lives without him. To me, that's nothing particularly worrying. I think that level of self-pitying social media post is quite common in thousands of teenagers and young adults.
He could communicate impersonally with people. So he'd put kind of cryptic things onto Facebook, hinting at his depressed state, hinting at the frustrations that he might have. And he'd get some kind of rapport from his family. But eventually, of course, he does exit that Facebook account and has another account in which he does not befriend his mother and family.
Having excluded his family from reading his online comments, was this a sign that he wanted them out of his life? Or was Jed, like many other young men, simply looking for some privacy from his family? The tone, though, of some of his posts on this site could have been considered alarming.
There were pictures of him with knives, and there was one with an axe.
But to Jed's friends, these were just a bit of fun.
They weren't surprised by what was on social media. To them, that was just sort of a side of his personality that wasn't particularly strange or unsettling or odd. To them, he was just a pretty ordinary guy.
Did any of Jed's posts suggest that he would become a killer?
There's nothing from what I can see on social media to indicate that he is going to kill. There's no kind of red flags, there's no warning sign.
There was an interest of Jed's, however, that could point to a darker side of the inner workings of his mind. He loved violent movies, computer games, and comic books. But can watching and absorbing these fictional depictions of violence really turn you into a murderer?
People always ask the question, if you watch horror films, does this make you into a killer? And the answer is no.
Perhaps Jed's interest in violent movies and comic books was just a form of escapism from his troubled home life. In fact, one fantasy character in particular seemed to capture Jed's imagination. The Wolverine, a mutant with superhuman strength and blades that protrude from his fists.
Wolverine is a bit of a good and bad cop. He's good sometimes, bad others. And that may have influenced him to think that sometimes you've got to be bad to get a good end, and the end justifies the means.
It can be argued that Jed styled himself on the character, bulking up in the gym, growing sideburns, getting a wolf tattoo, and even posing with knives between his fingers. But could this fascination with the character have compelled him to murder?
Many people have blamed Wolverine and dubbed him the Wolverine killer. But actually, I think the Wolverine fascination is a symptom of what was wrong in his life, not a cause. His interest in Wolverine was because he was struggling to cope with domestic problems at home.
So it appears that expressions of teenage angst online, a love of violent films and computer games, and even an interest in bizarre fantasy characters do not make a murderer. Jed was rather normal most of the time.
Go and burnt my head.
After leaving school, Jed studied horticulture at Abingdon and Whitney College.
Right then, let's get some work done.
And got a job in 2014 working as a gardener in the Oxford University parks.
People at the town council never had any problems with him. They never had any problems with the work he was doing, with his attitude, with the way that he was with people. So he was quite well liked.
I wonder what I should do today.
He was certainly popular at work, but was Jed a solitary person outside of his job?
We didn't get any indication that he was a loner. We got the impression that he had a close-knit group of friends.
Jed took part in many social activities with his friends, and in particular, he really enjoyed going to the gym.
He started going in 2012, and that was kind of one of his big hobbies. And generally, he just seemed like a pretty normal, straightforward, quiet guy.
But was the gym about more than just working out?
Adolescent males, sometimes if they're losing control or they're feeling a bit powerless in a situation, they take to strengthening themselves. They go to the gym, and this has a kind of like double effect. One, yes, they get the sensation that they're becoming stronger and perhaps more able to deal with whatever problem they have. They're also generating endorphins. This gives you an illusory sense of power. Many people walk out of the gym feeling like superheroes because they're high on their own hormones.
So were Jed's first signs of cracking evident in his teenage years?
Looking at his postings on social media, expressing that he's feeling sad or that he's feeling down, you can come across postings like that from thousands of teenagers every day. It doesn't necessarily indicate that there are horrible things ahead. So he is very much blending in at this time. He's exhibiting normal teenage behaviour.
Up to this, he's been extraordinarily robust, holding it together for his mom, for this dislocation of the family, trying to keep the family together. Really remarkable. And now he's beginning to show the first fissures, the first kind of troublesome markers. He's been diagnosed with depression.
He's had that label imposed upon him as somebody who suffers from depression, as somebody who's in need of medication. And I think that makes him feel quite vulnerable, and he starts reflecting on what's happened in his past, and perhaps this is quite a break point for him.
So we see the seeds now, problematic seeds being sown of the events to come, but there's not a tipping point yet.
No, he is trying desperately, I think, to reach out and seek support from people, but there will be very few people who understand what it is that he's experienced, and that will be incredibly frustrating for him.
And because he can't find anyone else to empathise with and he can share with him, then he finds more consolation in an alternative world.
He does. He starts to escape into a fantasy where he can explore some of those feelings in a safe space.
Coming up, Janet's behaviour becomes too much for Jed to bear.
He was frustrated by her drug habit, as he said. She was a junkie, she couldn't get her life together.
In May 2015, Jed Allen killed his stepfather, his mother and his 6-year-old half-sister before killing himself. Before he unleashed his violent rage, he had been a loving son and supportive brother, albeit within a troubled and dysfunctional family. Was there any particular spark that prompted this moment of madness? Jed's mother, Janet, was a long-term addict. By now, she was drinking heavily and regularly using heroin. Was this the key factor that drove Jed over the edge?
By late 2014, early 2015, Jed had mentioned to his friends that he was annoyed at his mum because she was, as he said, she was a junkie, she couldn't get her life together. He was frustrated by her drug habit. It was something that upset him.
For anybody who lives with someone who is addicted, it can be one of the most heartbreaking things to go through. Although Alan no doubt loved his mother, he would have found her an incredibly difficult person to be around at times, and he would have found her inconsistencies because of her addiction to be the most frustrating thing imaginable. That constant chronic frustration would no doubt result in anger on behalf of Alan, anger that his mum loved substances more than perhaps she loved him.
With his mother spiralling once again into her addictions, Jed appears to have tried hard to protect his half-sister Darren from the kind of damage that he had suffered in his early years.
Family and friends have said that he could be the most caring and loving brother in the world, which is completely at odds with what happened in the end.
Jed had communicated his problems at home to his close friends.
Not long before the murders, and some of his friends mentioned he hadn't maybe been himself. He'd mentioned that he was feeling a bit down, and he'd also mentioned at one point that he'd been having dark thoughts and about harming people who'd wronged him, but they didn't think much more of it than that he was in a bad mood.
But in fact, this was Jed expressing his despair about his life at home.
I think he'd reached a point where he'd done all he reasonably could do to live a normal life. He'd had a job, he had friends, and I think Alan was more and more frustrated that there was nothing he could do to save his mother, and there was nothing he could do to save his family from her destructive behaviour.
It's a madhouse, I tell you! A madhouse! I can't take this.
In May 2015, all his frustrations with his family situation and himself seemed to boil over. He felt helpless. But apart from the odd online comment, there was nothing to suggest he was going to go on a murderous rampage and annihilate his family. Saturday, 23rd of May, seemed to start as a normal day for Jed Allen. A trip to the gym, followed by a drink with friends. Jed had a quiet drink at this local pub with some friends before walking home to where his mother, stepfather and 6-year-old half-sister were spending the afternoon. He had given no indication to his friends that anything was out of the ordinary. In this house on May 23rd, 2015, Jed attacked his stepfather first and likely stabbed him, apparently while he was decorating the hallway. Neighbours later reported that they heard an argument break out between Jed and his stepfather, Philip.
He lost it. It was a short, brutal attack, multiple stab wounds.
Jed then headed upstairs and stabbed to death his mother and his little sister in a bedroom. Before leaving the house, he plunged the knife one more time into his stepfather.
And he left the knife in that body to give a very clear message of how angry he was and who his anger was directed at.
And that wasn't the only message that Jed left at the crime scene.
Most killers do not leave any notes or explanations. Most killers are often fairly cold-blooded. In the case of Jed, he wrote, "I'm sorry." Rather than cold-bloodedly carrying out this act, it was probably one that he had a great deal of emotional difficulty carrying it out.
But what was Jed's motive?
He sent out texts saying he did not want his family to face some kind of horrific future that he was aware of. He was taking these people out of the problem and stopping his little sister from facing a life of misery, and that this was ultimately the end.
The police manhunt tracked Jed to Oxford and the university parks. Within 48 hours of the crime, his body was found. By taking his own life, Jed took the reason for his bloody massacre to the grave, and now we can only speculate on his true motive.
When we have family annihilator killings such as this, there tends to be generally two motives. One, it's because the perpetrator is angry and annoyed with the family and it's an outburst of explosive anger. Another main type of family annihilation is to kill the family members to protect them from something bad that is about to happen in the future, bankruptcy or embarrassment or shame. I think in the case of Allen, his was a rare mixture of the two. I think he killed his mother and stepfather out of anger and frustration, but I think he then killed his sister because he didn't want her to live in care and not have her mother or father or indeed Allen in her life. So it's a very rare mixture of explosive anger and then a misguided mercy killing.
So was Jed's anger triggered by a loathing of his mom and stepfather's use of heroin?
It transpired at the inquest that Philip had used heroin at some point in reasonably recent past before he was killed. Janet had used it much more recently. She had traces of it in her system, and the coroner said that it was extremely likely that she would have been high on it at the time of her death.
What Jed was doing was taking away the pain of that family. What he saw in that family was, again, addiction, this time heroin addiction. Perhaps he had sympathy for the little girl that was going to grow up like him without her parents available to her because of their addiction problems. And he felt that the best thing for them is for them to die.
Is it possible that Jed's crime could have been predicted?
There's no previous. Jed is not abusing alcohol or drugs. He's not going out and getting into fights, causing trouble. There's no threats that I can see that he's made to the family. So it's unlikely anybody would have predicted this.
So what pushed Jed beyond breaking point on that fateful day? What in that house tipped him and sent him into the rage where he would, first of all, attack his stepdad?
I don't think it would have taken too much at this point in time. He'd expressed criticism openly of his mother for the first time, so I think this was something that was coming. It was not very far off, and if it wouldn't have happened on this day, it probably would have happened not too long afterwards.
We know from the toxicology reports that both Philip and his mother had heroin in their systems. So, you know, there would have been a huge frustration that he can exert control over his life, and yet, as he said before, his mother's life is a mess.
Yeah, the cycle's repeating itself again, isn't it? And everything is just getting far too much at this point. He wants to stop this because it's this unstoppable roller coaster.
What surprises me, though, he doesn't stop with the attack on Philip.
Had he just committed the one murder, that would have still created a trauma within that family unit. There would have been effects on his mother, effects on Darren. I think he wanted to just remove all of the trauma by removing all of the people. And I think on this day, he decided everybody had to die.
Including himself.
what is there for him now? He's been his mother's protector, his mother's carer, the person who stepped in when she went off the rails. Now that his mother and the people around her have been removed from the equation, what is his role? What is his function? I think at this point he's realising that that's it for me now, as well as for everybody else.
It seems to me that without the intervention of heroin into this world, into his world, I think that family would be alive today.
There was a cycle that kept repeating itself, and I think if it wasn't heroin, it perhaps would have been something else. But I just don't think that this young lad could bear to see this level of trauma again and again and again, and he had to put a stop to it.
So were the parental shortcomings of Jed Allen's mother the key factor that resulted in murder?
In Jed Allen's case, I think we can be safely sure that this was a case of nurture. It was a case of unlivable circumstances which precipitated someone into carrying out acts that they would not have carried out otherwise.
When I knew Jed was a gentle soul, and he must have been stressed to hell to do what he did. Must have been terrible for him.